There's a particular kind of suffering that comes not from catastrophe or loss, but from the slow realization that you've been living the same day over and over again, trapped in a loop of familiar thoughts and predictable reactions, looking in the mirror and seeing not a stranger but something worse. The exact same person you were a year ago, 5 years ago, still carrying the same fears, still making the same excuses, still negotiating with the same weaknesses that you promised yourself you'd overcome. This isn't the kind of pain that makes headlines or demands sympathy. It's quiet, corrosive, the kind that eats away at you in the moments between sleep and waking when you're honest enough to admit that something fundamental needs to break, and that something, the version of yourself that you've been protecting, that you've been defending, that you've been carrying like dead weight through every failed attempt at change. That version doesn't need improvement or adjustment or a few new habits layered on top of the same crumbling foundation. It needs to be completely dismantled, erased, destroyed so thoroughly that going back becomes impossible. Not just difficult, but genuinely impossible, because you've burned every bridge that leads to who you used to be. Most people talk about change like it's decoration, like you can just paint over the walls and call it transformation. But real change, the kind that actually matters, the kind that rewrites your entire existence, it doesn't happen through addition. It happens through subtraction, through the brutal process of stripping away everything you thought you were, until all that remains is the raw material of who you could become. And this is where people get it wrong, where they fail before they even begin, because they want to keep one foot in their old life while stepping into the new one. They want to grow without sacrifice, evolve without pain, become someone different while still holding on to every familiar piece of themselves. But transformation doesn't work like that. It demands totality. It requires that you make a choice so decisive, so absolute, that retreat becomes not just undesirable, but genuinely unavailable to you. Think about why ancient warriors burned their ships after landing on enemy shores. It wasn't theatrics or bravado. It was psychology. It was strategy. It was the recognition that human beings will always choose the path of least resistance, unless that path is physically removed from the map. When you burn the ships, you eliminate the option of going back. And when going back isn't an option, you have no choice but to move forward with everything you have. The same principle applies to your life right now, to the person you've been and the person you need to become, because until you make your transformation non-negotiable, until you remove every escape route back to your old patterns, you will always find yourself pulled back by the gravity of who you are. Your past isn't just memory sitting passively in your mind. It's active momentum. It's the accumulated weight of every thought you've repeated, every pattern you've reinforced, every identity you've accepted as permanent truth. And as long as you maintain any connection to that past version of yourself, as long as you leave even the smallest thread intact, you will use it to pull yourself back the moment things get difficult. The moment uncertainty creeps in, the moment your new identity feels uncomfortable or unfamiliar. This is why so many people cycle through the same problems year after year, why they make promises to themselves in moments of clarity, and then break those promises the instant pressure arrives. It's not because they lack willpower or discipline. It's because they never actually severed the connection to who they used to be. They remodeled the house, but kept the foundation cracked, and eventually, everything built on top of it collapses back into the same So what does it actually mean to destroy your old self? To burn those bridges so completely that return becomes impossible. It means you stop carrying the past as an excuse for the present. It means when you catch yourself saying, "This is just who I am," or "I've always been this way," you immediately challenge that statement with the question, "Who do I choose to become right now, in this moment, regardless of who I was yesterday?" Because identity isn't fixed, it isn't written in stone. It isn't determined by your history or your genetics or the way you've behaved for the last 10 years. Identity is fluid, malleable, constantly being shaped by the thoughts you think and the actions you take, and the standards you hold yourself to, which means every single day you have the opportunity to cast a vote for a new version of yourself. And when you cast enough votes in the same direction, eventually the transformation becomes undeniable. But you can't cast those votes half-heartedly. You can't rebuild yourself on Tuesday and then reconnect with your old patterns on Wednesday. You have to make the decision complete, absolute, irreversible, which might mean cutting off people who knew the old you and can't see the new you, walking away from environments that trigger your old behaviors, deleting every digital connection to habits you've outgrown, purging your space of anything that reminds you of who you no longer want to be. This isn't cruelty and it isn't coldness. It's self-preservation. It's the recognition that your future is too valuable to sacrifice for nostalgia or comfort or the false security of familiar dysfunction. And yes, people will notice. They'll say you've changed, and they won't mean it as a compliment. They'll call you distant, arrogant, cold, different. And what they're really saying is that you're no longer playing the role they assigned to you. You're no longer shrinking to make them comfortable. You're no longer available for the dynamics that kept everyone stuck in place. Let them say it. Let them wonder. Let them interpret your silence, however they need to, because you're not walking away from people. You're walking away from the version of yourself that those relationships required you to be. And there's a profound difference between the two. The old you needed validation, needed approval, needed constant reassurance that you were acceptable and understood and liked. The new you needs none of that, because the new you has learned that the most important approval is the one you give yourself. And that approval comes not from being comfortable or popular or understood, but from living in alignment with standards you've chosen consciously, rather than standards you've absorbed unconsciously from a world that profits from your media. Understand that when you commit to this level of transformation, when you truly burn the bridges back to your old identity, you're going to spend time alone, significant time, maybe more time than you've ever spent in your life, and that solitude is going to feel uncomfortable at first, maybe even frightening, because most people have been conditioned to interpret aloneness as loneliness, to see solitude as punishment rather than power. But here's what actually happens when you learn to walk alone, when you stop outsourcing your decisions and your values and your self-worth to other people. You begin to hear your own voice clearly for the first time. Not the voice that's been shaped by expectation and conditioning and the need to fit in, but the voice that knows what you actually want, what you actually value, what you're actually capable of becoming. That voice has always been there, but you couldn't hear it over the noise of everyone else's opinions and judgments and projections, and it's only in silence, in the space between who you were and who you're becoming, that you can finally hear it clearly enough to follow it. Walking alone doesn't mean you're antisocial or broken or damaged. It means you've reached a level of self-awareness where you understand that not everyone deserves access to your energy, your time, your attention, your presence, and more importantly, you understand that your growth is not a group project. Nobody else can do this work for you. Nobody else can destroy your old self and rebuild you from the ground up. That's your responsibility, your burden, your sacred duty to yourself. And it's work that has to be done in silence, without applause, without validation, without anyone watching or caring or even noticing. This is where most people quit, in that gap between starting the transformation and seeing the results, in that space where you're doing everything right, but nothing looks different yet, where you're showing up every day, but the world hasn't caught up to who you're becoming. Most people interpret that gap as failure, and use it as permission to return to the familiar. But the ones who make it through, the ones who actually complete the transformation, they understand that the gap isn't failure, it's incubation. It's the necessary period where the old self dies and the new self is being forged in darkness before it emerges into light. Now let's talk about what needs to die. Specifically, concretely, because vague intentions produce vague results, and you can't destroy what you haven't clearly identified. The old you had certain patterns, certain responses, certain behaviors that served a purpose at one time. Maybe they kept you safe, or helped you survive, or protected you from pain. But those same patterns are now the chains holding you back from everything you want to become. Maybe it's the pattern of people-pleasing, of saying yes when you mean no, of contorting yourself to fit other people's expectations because you're terrified of disappointing them or being disliked. Maybe it's the pattern of self-sabotage, of getting close to success and then unconsciously destroying it because deep down you don't believe you deserve it or you're afraid of what it will require you to become. Maybe it's the pattern of distraction, of numbing yourself with substances or screens or noise because sitting with your own thoughts feels too uncomfortable, too confronting, too real. Maybe it's the pattern of settling, of accepting less than you deserve in relationships, in work, in life, because part of you has internalized the belief that this is all you're capable of. This is all you're worth. Whatever your specific patterns are, you know them. You've felt them operating beneath the surface of your choices for years. And the first step in destroying them is admitting that they exist, that they're real, that they're costing you more than you've been willing to acknowledge. Once you've identified the patterns, you have to go deeper and ask where they came from. Not so you can blame your past or use it as an excuse, but so you can understand the root system that's been feeding these behaviors. Because you can't pull out a weed by cutting the flower, you have to dig down and extract the entire root, or it just grows back. Most of your limiting patterns were installed early, probably in childhood or adolescence, by parents who projected their fears onto you, by teachers who dismissed your potential, by peers who rejected you for being different, by early failures that you never fully processed, by trauma you experienced but never healed. These experiences created beliefs, often unconscious beliefs that you've been running on autopilot ever since. Beliefs like I'm not good enough, or I'm not worthy, or I'm not capable, or people always leave, or success is for other people, not for me. These beliefs became the operating system of your mind, the invisible code determining your decisions, your reactions, your entire life trajectory, and until you bring them into conscious awareness and challenge them directly, they will continue to run your life from the shadow. Challenging these beliefs requires brutal honesty, the kind of honesty that doesn't flinch or make excuses or soften the truth to protect your ego. You have to sit with yourself, maybe with a journal, maybe in meditation, maybe just in the quiet of early morning, and you have to ask the hard questions. Where did I learn that I wasn't enough? What evidence do I actually have that this belief is true? How has holding this belief served me or protected me? What would I be capable of if I no longer believed this? And then, most importantly, you have to start installing new beliefs, consciously, deliberately, through repetition and action, because the mind learns through pattern, and the fastest way to overwrite an old pattern is to replace it with a new one that's repeated so consistently it becomes automatic. You don't try to believe the new thing. You act as if it's already true. You make decisions from the identity you're building rather than the identity you're leaving behind. And over time, through accumulated evidence of your own actions, the new belief becomes real. Not because you convinced yourself intellectually, but because you proved it experientially. This is where discipline becomes non-negotiable. Not the punishment version of discipline that people talk about when they're trying to force themselves to do things they hate, but the liberating version of discipline that comes from alignment, from knowing exactly who you want to become, and then structuring your entire life around that vision with such clarity that every decision becomes obvious. When you have that kind of clarity, discipline isn't about forcing yourself. It's about protecting yourself from anything that doesn't serve the person you're becoming. And that protection requires boundaries, strong boundaries, sacred boundaries, boundaries that you enforce without apology or explanation or negotiation. You have to become ruthless about what you allow into your life, into your mind, into your space, because everything you consume is either feeding your transformation or feeding your old patterns. There is no neutral. And if you're not deliberately choosing what influences you, then you're being influenced by default, by whatever is loudest or closest or most convenient, which is almost never what's best for you. This means you have to audit everything: your relationships, your media consumption, your daily habits, your physical environment, your internal dialogue, everything. And you have to ask of each thing, does this serve who I'm becoming, or does this reinforce who I'm leaving behind? And if the answer is the latter, you have to remove it, immediately, completely, without sentiment. That friend who always pulls you back into old behaviors, that social media account that makes you feel inadequate, that comfortable routine that keeps you stuck in place, that voice in your head that speaks to you with contempt or doubt or resignation, all of it has to go, not gradually, not eventually, but now, because every day you spend in proximity to your old patterns is a day you're vulnerable to regression, and regression is the death of transformation. You cannot rebuild yourself while standing in the ruins of who you used to be. You have to clear the space completely, burn it down to bare ground, and only then can you start building something new on a foundation that's solid, that's clean, that's entirely yours. And yes, this process will isolate you, probably more than you expect, probably more than feels comfortable, because as you change, as you elevate, as you refuse to participate in the dynamics and conversations and activities that used to define your social life, people will drift away or be pushed away, and you'll find yourself alone more often than not, at least for a while, and that's exactly what's supposed to happen. You're not losing people. You're losing versions of yourself that those people needed you to be. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for both yourself and them is to let the relationship end rather than forcing yourself to shrink back into a shape that no longer fits. There will be grief in this, real grief. Because even though you're choosing it, even though you know it's necessary, letting go still hurts, and you have to allow yourself to feel that hurt without using it as an excuse to turn back. You feel it. You honor it. You acknowledge that something is ending. And then you keep moving forward because your commitment to your future has to be stronger than your attachment to your past, always, in every moment, in every decision. The transformation you're undergoing isn't cosmetic. It isn't surface level. It isn't about changing your clothes or your hairstyle or your job title, although those things might change as a byproduct. The transformation is fundamental. It's about rewiring your nervous system, reprogramming your subconscious, rebuilding your identity from the cellular level up. And that kind of change takes time, more time than you want it to take, more time than feels fair or reasonable, but it takes exactly as long as it needs to take. And rushing it or resenting it or comparing your progress to someone else's will only slow you down. You have to surrender to the process while simultaneously driving the process, which sounds paradoxical, but it's the exact balance you need, the balance between acceptance and action, between patience and urgency, between being okay with where you are right now while refusing to stay there a moment longer than necessary. This is the dance of transformation, and you learn the steps by doing them, by showing up every single day even when you don't see progress, even when you feel like you are going backwards, even when every cell in your body is screaming to return to the familiar patterns that at least felt safe, even if they were slowly destroyed. What sustains you through this period, through the isolation and the discomfort and the slow, invisible progress, is purpose. Not the generic find your purpose advice that gets thrown around like confetti, but real purpose, bone-deep purpose, the kind that wakes you up at 3 in the morning with an intensity that borders on obsession. You have to know why you're doing this. And the why can't be shallow. It can't be about impressing people or proving them wrong or achieving some external marker of success, because those motivations will evaporate the moment things get hard. Your why has to be internal. It has to be about becoming someone you can respect, someone you can trust, someone you wouldn't be ashamed to meet in the mirror every morning. And when that becomes your driving force, when your transformation is about self-respect rather than external validation, you become unstoppable because no one can take that away from you. No one can invalidate it. No one can tell you it doesn't matter because it matters to you. And that's the only opinion that... As you continue this work, as you burn the old bridges and walk alone and install new patterns and protect your space and stay committed to the process, something begins to shift. Something subtle at first, but increasingly undeniable. You start to notice that you think differently, that situations that used to trigger you now roll off your back, that people who used to control you with guilt or anger or manipulation now have no power because you've stopped giving them access to your emotional state. You start to notice that you're making different choices, that when faced with the old temptations or patterns, you don't even feel pulled toward them anymore, because they belong to someone you no longer are. You start to notice that you carry yourself differently, that you speak with more clarity, that you set boundaries without anxiety, that you pursue what you want without apology, that you've developed a kind of inner authority that doesn't need to announce itself, because it's simply present in everything. This is the evidence that the transformation is taking root, that you're not just performing a new identity, but actually becoming it. And that evidence, that internal knowing that you're different now in ways that cannot be reversed, that becomes the fuel that carries you through the final stages of the rebuild,